Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. The United Nations remains the largest intergovernmental organization in the world, and it has made tremendous positive contributions to maintaining peace and stability. However, many people say the world is changing very fast, and it's time for the UN to engage in deep reforms so that it can strengthen its ability to live up to expectations of 193 member states of the United Nations. So how should the United Nations reform itself? As many other similar organizations such as G20, G7 are attempting to do much the same job. To answer these and other questions, I'm very happy to be joined here in this exclusive interview by Mr. Peter Thomson, the President-elect for the 71st session of the UN General Assembly. But before we start the interview, let's look at this.
Peter Thomson is a world-renowned Fijian diplomat who has served as Fiji's permanent representative to the United Nations since February 2010. He started his career as a civil servant in Fiji in 1972, and from 1988 onwards he worked as an investment and management consultant for various government agencies, regional organisations and investment corporations. He resumed diplomatic duties for Fiji in 2010. As Fiji's permanent representative, Thomson has chaired the United Nations' largest negotiating bloc, the Group of 77 and China, and served as chair of the Executive Board of the UN Development Programme, the UN Population Fund, and the UN Office for Project Services. Thomson served as UNGA Vice President from 2010 to 2011. He is the first national of a Pacific Island country to be elected to the presidency in the history of the UN. On June 13, 2016, Peter Thomson was elected as the next President of the United Nations General Assembly.
I am accountable at the end of the 71st session.
He said he will place special attention on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change and ocean issues.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir. What are the major issues on your agenda when you were having talks with our President or with our leaders in Beijing?
I came across to Beijing from New York, firstly to show my respects to the largest country in my regional group, Asia Pacific group. I come from Fiji, and first of all to come over and pay my respects. Secondly, we wanted to talk about the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which China is taking a very leading role in. And this is central to my interests as President of the General Assembly for the 71st session.
Congratulations on your success of being elected President of the UN General Assembly, particularly a representative from Fiji, such a small country, in sharp contrast against the sizable population of 1.3 billion in the PRC. But this is amazing indeed.
Yeah.
It somehow displays the spirit of democracy on an equal footing. But having said this, what do you think of the message of G20 and its relationship with the sustainability of the year 2030?
We are very pleased at the United Nations to see that China, through its presidency of G20, has introduced the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which was created by the United Nations last year by the leaders of all 193 nations, that was adopted at the United Nations last year, that this has been integrated into the G20 agenda and is expected to be one of the main outcomes of the G20 this year, will be this integration of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda into the economic governance which the G20 is responsible for.
But the United Nations, including G20, one of the multilateral institutions or mechanisms, whatever you call it, would only serve to be a talking shop. It doesn't have the teeth, it doesn't have the ability to execute the initiatives and proposals. So what do you think of the responsibilities of the member states of up to 193 of the UN?
Yeah. Well, this 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which gives us 14 years now to work towards the achievement of this agenda, contains 17 sustainable development goals, which cover everything from hunger, health, to
fixing some of the major problems concerning the shape of health for those women and kids in developing countries. What could, for example, WHO do?
Well, there's a specific goal on health which addresses such things as levels of infant mortality and so on. There are many targets within the health goal. But, you know, I would bring your attention to a very important meeting coming up next month in New York, which is it's called the Antimicrobial Resistance Summit. And this relates to the end of the antibiotic age. Antibiotics are losing their potency for curing human beings for certain types of infections. So this is the kind of challenge for health that we're facing in the future, that we have to put in new investments, new research into finding new drugs and better ways of looking after human health than we're currently doing.
How do you assess the working relationship between organizations such as UNESCO, UNIDO, WHO, and local governments in the host countries in the implementation of your 17 goals?
I believe that these organizations are very important touchstones for every national government. I was president of the board of UNDP some years ago, and I went and did field visits with the board to individual countries. And what I found was that these officers were very much valued by the national governments concerned, because they were not the answer to their problems, but they were the repository of world-best knowledge, world-best advice on any aspect of your national plan. You can go down the road and see the UNDP or UNICEF or UNIDO and get the best advice possible.
This year is an election year for the United States.
Yes.
Many people question the ability of the U.S. Government to implement what has been achieved in Paris and in Copenhagen by the next generation of the American leadership, because they have so many domestic, economic, and political woes to fix the problems of bipartisan wrangling, so to speak, the rise of populism. Are you serious about their responsibilities?
Now, I'm very hopeful that the U.S. will ratify the Paris Agreement before the end of this year. Every indication is that they will, and that with China and the U.S. having ratified, and so many other countries like Brazil, and my own country, Fiji, was in fact the first country to ratify, then I think we've got the agreement rolling into place. This is absolutely essential to the saving our grandchildren's place on this planet. The Paris Agreement takes us to a position where we are trying to keep within 2 degrees of increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere. If we start going beyond that, we are really placing our grandchildren in jeopardy. If you get up to 3 degrees or up to 4 degrees, the insurance industry of the world, for example, will not be able to cover risk anymore. There will just be too many climate change related disasters for the insurance industry to function. So the stakes are very, very high in implementing the Paris Agreement and implementing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, because the 13th goal of this agenda is to address climate change in a meaningful way.
Your Excellency, no one can question the legitimacy of your representation and concern of a man who comes from Fiji, a low-lying country in the Pacific. How serious is the urgency for your population and for your agenda to be submitted to the G20 or the United Nations, where it is the great powers that dominate and formulate the agenda of the climate change?
You know, I think that the world's opinion was shifted because of the plight of the small island developing states. In Fiji's case, we have mountains, so we're not so badly off. But some of our neighbors, like the Republic of Kiribati or the Republic of Tuvalu or Republic of Marshall Islands, these countries have no high ground. They are atoll states. And sea levels are going to rise because of climate change this century by at least 1.5 meters. That puts these countries under water. So we have leveraged that disastrous future into making the world realize that it's not just the small island countries. It's everybody with the low-lying coastlines. You only have to think about the great delta areas of Asia, like Bangladesh or Vietnam, or indeed the great delta areas anywhere in the world, many of which are bread baskets for food security. To see them go underwater, you have to ask very serious questions about our future in the 21st century. So climate change is the great challenge of the 21st century.
China is the host country for the G20 summit in Hangzhou, and we raised a slogan that's composed of 4 major points: innovation, inclusiveness, interconnectivity, and invigoration. Among the 4, I'm afraid interconnectivity actually refers to the ability to build a network that helps developed and developing nations to pursue co-prosperity. Are you optimistic that, for example, with regard to climate change and the urgency about the rise of the sea levels, those low-lying countries will be able to get compensation as promised from developed countries so that they could get relieved?
Yes. Yes, I am optimistic. The Green Climate Fund is now operational. In fact, my own country, Fiji, we've just taken out a $43 million grant from that Green Climate Fund to address our sewerage and water infrastructure, which is close to that sea level rise area. So it's now swinging into place, the Green Climate Fund. So I'm optimistic that, that the necessary work will be done. You mentioned the theme of the G20. For me, innovation is really the most exciting one, because I think this is really the key. Whether you're talking about climate change or about any of the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, innovation is key. And having innovated, sharing your innovation. So technology transfer is a very important part of the agenda, and we expect China to be one of the leading parties in this regard. And China already is sharing its knowledge throughout the developing world, for which we're very grateful.
You've been elected President of the UN General Assembly. One of the issues on the agenda that captures the attention of the media around the world is reform of the United Nations. That's been the concern for many large economies. And in fact, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, said it's now the time, the moment to reform the UN. Otherwise, it will not die, but it will fade away. It will lose its relevance.
I wouldn't agree with that comment. Definitely not. But look, the United Nations is based on the UN Charter. The principles and purposes are shared by all of us. I have not heard of any country at the United Nations which is against reform. Everybody realizes that this organization, formed 70 years ago, has to reform itself. It's an organic kind of institution. We have the bedrock of the UN Charter, but we are changing all the time organically by resolutions which are passed in the General Assembly, for example. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. We have a group called the Ad Hoc Working Group on GA Revitalization. I'm sorry about the UN slogan, but that is the name of a very effective group which is about reform of the GA. And that's ongoing. It never goes away. It's always doing its work from year to year. For example, this year I will be the first president who will take office adopting a code of conduct, an ethical code of conduct. This is an innovation made this year. And I will have to take an oath of office. This is the first time. So, in other words, there's reforms going on at the United Nations all the time. In relation to the Security Council reform, we have an intergovernmental negotiation process, which again is ongoing, and it's making progress. There's convergence happening, but there's no artificial timelines to be followed here. I mean, this is about all 193 countries moving together and doing the reform as necessary.
Years after the Cold War, it seems the Security Council is again quite divided over some of the regional issues, such as the invasion of Iraq. And the British Parliament released an investigation report about whether it's right or wrong for the British troops to be involved in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the US-led invasion. So it gave rise to the issue of why authority of the UN Security Council is often bypassed. Is that major difficulty for your generation of the leadership to overcome?
No, I'm a great believer that the Security Council must assume its full responsibilities as exemplified by the UN Charter. In the General Assembly, we also have some role to play in world security, but the major responsibility devolves to the Security Council, so we call upon the Security Council to exercise their responsibilities.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Peter Thomson, the newly elected President of the UN General Assembly. We've been talking about UN reform, G20 goals, and of course the ambitious blueprint of sustainability by the year 2030 by the new generation of the leadership of the United Nations General Assembly. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, sir. Which platform or mechanism will be held more accountable between the UN, G20, G7? We have developed so many mechanisms. What do you think of the overlapping functions? Which is the most important? Leaders from the most developed countries who proudly declare they are the biggest and strongest. But in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the G20 emerged very quickly to live up to the expectations of people in developing countries. Look, you are held responsible for much of the financial derivatives in the Wall Street, so you are no longer as relevant as you have been. Now it's the mission of G20 to look after well-being of humanity. What do you think?
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, obviously when it comes to financial markets, size matters. And what we're looking to from the G20, particularly the forthcoming summit in Hangzhou, is the G20 moving from reacting to crises to more forward-looking policies of good economic governance for the world economy. And that's what we're hoping will be one of the major outcomes from the G20 summit. But you can't take away from the United Nations the fact that we are the world body which represents all 193 nations, and the scope of our work is so broad.
Your Excellency, in fact, the point of my question is about global governance. 70 years in the wake of the Second World War, a lot of developing countries deliver their voices of discontent about the existing international political and economic order, particularly the financial order, which was so devastating, wreaking havoc with development in developing countries, such as the GDP growth in the sub-Sahara region, which used to enjoy up to 5% of the GDP growth rate, but that was a big problem after the financial crisis. Yeah. So, is it a high time to take a second look at the issue of governance, global governance?
Look, Fiji was the president of G77 in China in 2013, and I was the chair in New York, and I spent a lot of time pushing for the fact that the Bretton Woods institutions need to be reformed to reflect the
new realities.
Aspirations, the new realities, particularly of the developing countries, to get wider voting rights and to get greater recognition by the world financial system. This is the future of the world. We shouldn't be held back to those old institutional rules.
It's reported that in September, the UN General Assembly will host a high-level summit to address the large movements of refugees and migrants. So this is a major concern for the European Union. So what do you think of this humanitarian crisis?
My view is that migration is a constant in humanity. We've been migrating for many, many centuries, many millennia. Human movement around the planet is not something which begins and ends yesterday or tomorrow. So is this a crisis? Perhaps for some countries it is viewed as a crisis, but we've had many such crises in the past, and we'll have many more in the future. What is important is to, first of all, accept that this is a natural thing for human beings to do, to move about. That is our nature. The second is that with 9 billion people on the planet, we will need to have better management of the movement of people, so that supply and demand and human rights and so on are being properly managed. You alluded to the fact that next month in New York, in fact on the 19th of September, there will be a summit on migrants and refugees. And we expect many of the world's leading figures to be there to address that. The outcome document has already been negotiated by the 193 member states of the United Nations. It's a very solid document, recognizing the need to guarantee human rights of migrants and working towards, there's going to be a New York declaration on migrants and refugees coming out of that summit. And that will work towards a compact on migration for the whole world to be adopted hopefully in 2018. That's where we're proceeding on the migrants and refugees.
Almost half of the population in Syria has been left homeless internally and externally. That's one of the worst and most devastating humanitarian crises since the end of the Second World War,
Correct.
causing the rise of far-right movement in continental Europe and the terrorist attacks in France, for example. So how do you see a solution? Where do you stand about seeking a solution to the crisis in Syria?
Those are obviously huge questions, and the responsibility lies with the Security Council to get the answers to those. There is a deep sense of frustration that it has taken so long to get those answers. I was discussing with your foreign minister today the positive role that China can play, the positive role that the General Assembly can play. We're all searching because we're all deeply seized with the need for a solution to this great humanitarian crisis.
You only have 1 year of a presidency.
Yes,
That's not long enough, for example, to get so many things done
I agree.
effectively and efficiently, so to speak. So what is your goal, which must be very realistic,
Yeah.
so that it could be very close to what you want to achieve and very close to the expectations of the constituency that put you in the position?
Yes. If you think about the role of the presidency of the General Assembly, it's very similar to being the chairman of a board of a corporation. The Secretary General...
You mean your job is to build consensus?
Exactly. And to oversee the work of your management, which is the UN Secretariat in this case, and the CEO of your organization, which in this case is the UN Secretary General, currently Mr. Ban Ki-moon. And so the role of the President is more as a chairman of the board to have oversight, to advise the Secretary General on the opinion of the General Assembly, and to preside over the General Assembly. So that's why it's a 1-year term, as opposed to the Secretary General, which is a 5-year term. And that's where you get the continuity of action at the United Nations. But the presidency is meant as giving the overall guidance to the work of the organization. So yes, I do feel that a year is too short a term, but that's the rules of the organization, and I stand by those. So to answer your question, what do I want to do in my 1 year? The big goal for me is to transform our world in getting the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, getting the wheels turning during my term in office. And that has to be done through education, getting the Sustainable Development Goals taught in every classroom in the world, getting the necessary finance, the trillions of dollars that will be necessary to implement all these goals.
Is that the legacy of your presidency?
That will be, I'll be judged as a failure or a success on the basis of that alone.
Will you be one of the presidents who will go down history overseeing election of your next CEO, chief of the United Nations? Because Mr. Ban Ki-moon will step down and his term will expire.
Yes. We expect a new selection of the new Secretary General to occur by probably October. And
next year?
No, this year.
This year?
This year, yes. Mr. Ban Ki-moon's term ends at the end of this year. So the new Secretary General should be selected by early October, I imagine. That's the job of the Security Council to select. We at the General Assembly have had a long, let's say, beauty contest this year.
On the key stage?
Yeah, where all 12 candidates came and presented themselves to us. Very, very useful and excellent candidates. 12 very good candidates. There are now only 10 left. And it's been a very useful process, so we'll have a very strong Secretary General. We know this because of the caliber that we've seen in our interviews that we had with the General Assembly. But it's up to the Security Council now to make the selection, and then we in the GA appoint by way of a resolution before the end of the year. That'll be done, and the new Secretary General, he or she, will start work on January 1st.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate your participation in this additional dialogue.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.